Washington. And then there were 16, as former Texas Governor Rick Perry on Friday became the first candidate to drop out of the Republican race. There's been a dramatic shuffle of the GOP field. Early frontrunners like Jeb Bush and Scott Walker have fallen back, while outsiders like Donald Trump and Ben Carson have surged to the lead. Meanwhile, Ohio Governor John Kasich has made steady progress, especially in the first primary state of New Hampshire. I spoke with him earlier. Governor, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Always a pleasure, Chris.
Governor, you're still trailing in the national polls, but according to the latest Real Clear Politics average in New Hampshire, you've jumped into second place behind Donald Trump and ahead of Jeb Bush. You're running as a practical, compassionate conservative. Will that work for a career politician in the so-called year of the outsider?
You know, Chris, it's interesting. I've always kind of hesitated to define myself, but, I have both an inside game and an outside game. I've always been a reformer. All the time I served in public office, and I remain a reformer in Ohio, but I also know how to get things done. And I think it's important that while we acknowledge the anxieties that Americans have, I think it's also important that we realize at the end of the day, we need to have somebody who knows how to land a plane. And I've landed quite a few planes, chairman of the Budget Committee in Washington, balanced budget, Pentagon reform, Ohio, turning Ohio around. So I've been able to land the plane, and a lot of passengers have been happy, and I haven't even served any drinks. Maybe a peanut or two.
As we said at the top, you're one of the few candidates who have stayed out of the food fight with Donald Trump. Do you think some of your rivals are making a mistake taking on Trump? And do you think that voters are eventually going to tire of him?
Well, look, I got to tell you about my game plan rather than theirs. And here's the thing, Chris. I am unknown largely nationally. In fact, as one of the top-tier candidates, I have a lot of room to grow and people get to know me. So if I'm talking about somebody else or judging somebody else, then I'm not talking about myself. And I need to let people know who I am. And that's, I think, frankly, why we're doing pretty well in New Hampshire. We're starting to grow in other states, doing better in Iowa. But what's most important to me is what happens in the early states. I mean, I love the people of Nebraska or Hawaii, but frankly, at this point in time, that's not what's critical. What's critical is what happens in the early states and how I introduce myself. So if I'm talking about Donald Trump or somebody else or their strategy, I'm not talking about what I want to talk about, and I think that doesn't make any sense.
All right. Well, let's talk some issues. Some congressional Republicans say they're willing to shut down the government when the budget runs out at the end of the month if that's what it takes to defund Planned Parenthood. Do you support that?
Well, first of all, I think Planned Parenthood ought to be defunded, no question about it. We're doing everything we can in Ohio to figure out how to get that done. Secondly, though, if you're going to shut the government down, you're never going to get anything signed by the president because he's in total opposition. So you'd shut the government down, and then over time you'd have to open it back up again, and you wouldn't have achieved much. So I think there are other ways for Congress to try to deal with this, and they need to be more creative in regard to Planned Parenthood. But when you shut the government down, people don't like it, and you shouldn't shut it down unless you have a great chance of success. I was involved in the shutdown in the 90s. But as a result of that, we got a federally balanced budget because we kind of knew that there were a number of people in the Clinton administration that believed it needed to be done. But you've got to be very careful when it comes to shutting down the federal government.
Well, let me put this up, though, because back in '95, as you point out, when you were chair of the House Budget Committee, you were very proud of the fact that you took part in a government shutdown. Here is, forgive me, sir, a much younger John Kasich.
This is one of the best times in our nation's history because we are fighting over deeply held principles.
But, Governor, what some people would say is, look, that was just about money. That was just about the budget. In this case, we're talking about what Planned Parenthood is doing to fetuses.
No, I understand. But here's the thing, Chris. We really suspected that if we did fight, and first of all, it's not just about the budget. It's about our children's future. It's about debt. It's about economic growth. But we had a pretty good sense that if we stood our ground back then, that we could actually move a balanced budget forward. I think in this case, the president's made it clear he's not going to sign it. Now, look, I'm willing to fight all day long, but you've got to have a good prospect of being able to be successful. Because if you're not successful, you shut the government down, you open it up, and you haven't achieved anything, you're just going to have people shake their head and wonder what your thinking was. So I'm not telling you that there aren't times when you need to do it, but as governor, you know, I face things that are really important, and there may be a case or two where I might say, okay, if we don't stick to good principle, we may have to not fund it. But I've avoided that, and I think that's what we need to do. Here's the other thing. I feel very strongly about being able to defund Planned Parenthood and a lot of other things. But if you're not going to be successful, then you have to be careful to think about other ways to achieve your objective, Chris.
Governor, let's talk about some foreign issues. A number of your rivals say if they're elected, they will rip up the Iran nuclear deal their first day in the White House. You say you don't get that. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, we don't know what's going to happen in 18 months. Secondly, I've been on the Defense Committee for 18 years, and you've got to be careful not to paint red lines and that you can't keep. In addition to that, I think we ought to hold Iran totally accountable for what they do, if they break any part of this deal, if they fund the radicals like Hamas and Hezbollah. You know, then I think in that kind of a case, we've got to slap the sanctions back on. We would then have the high moral ground to talk to our allies and get them to go along with us. But in addition to that, if we get to the point where we think that Iran may be developing a nuclear weapon, if we think they're to the point where they could have a situation, well, then I think military action would be warranted. But let's wait till we get there, and let's stay calm, because that's one of the most important things we need to do when it comes to foreign affairs and the way in which we manage our national security. We don't want anybody to get away with anything, but we got to make clear that we are holding them accountable. If they violate the deal, back the sanctions, bring our allies on, and if they get to a point where they can have a nuke, then all options are on the table.
Let me ask you about another foreign policy issue. What about the refugee crisis in Europe? President Obama announced this week that we will take in 10,000 Syrian refugees over the next year. Where are you on that?
I support that. I think it's very important that we don't let anybody infiltrate who's part of a radical group. But America needs to be part of this solution. This is a terrific problem in terms of the flow of humanity. It's fundamentally a European problem, but I think there's some things we can do. Not beyond taking some of these people in, as long as we're sure of who they are. I think we can provide some logistical support so people aren't losing their lives, and in addition, maybe some humanitarian aid. I think we need to look at this, Chris, as an opportunity to try to draw closer to our European friends who we've drifted away from. And there's another lesson. When you draw red lines, when you don't have an aggressive U.S. foreign policy, and oftentimes it sows confusion, and that's what we're seeing in this case. Finally, I think it's very important that Europe and Western civilization begin to stand up for its fundamental values. They're primarily Jewish and Christian values, so that when these folks come, that we can have assimilation, so they don't change us, but maybe in some ways we either change them or live peacefully, of course, peacefully with them, and we have a full integration.
Governor, in the time we have left, let's do a lightning round. I know how much you enjoy this. Quick questions, quick answers.
I do like lightning rounds.
You said recently that you would support a, quote, reasonable increase in the federal minimum wage, and then you backed off.
No.
Well,
No. People were asking me about minimum wage, and I said it's very important that we don't raise the minimum wage willy-nilly and we end up throwing out of work the lowest and the most unskilled workers. I also said that if you're going to have a raising the minimum wage, it ought to be something that gets calculated between employers and labor. And I fundamentally believe it ought to be done at the state level. That's what I said, and I have to clarify. I'll make it clear. That's what I believe.
Okay. In your 2010 campaign for governor, you were quoted as saying that you would amend the Constitution to end birthright citizenship. But more recently, this time you've said, leave the Constitution alone, let them be citizens. Why the change?
Well, because I'd like to get this done, and I think that the issue of birthright citizenship, part of the in terms of the 14th Amendment, it makes it clear, and that when you're born here, you become a citizen. So bringing that issue up, because we do need to we need to finish the fence, protect our border, have a reasonable guest worker program so people can come in and out. The lawbreakers go to prison or they're deported, and the rest of the people pay a fine, they wait, and they can be legalized. I think that's something the American people would support, and I think it's something that could pass Congress, and I'm interested in getting things done, not just banging the podium, being an ideologue, and making statements. I want to see America function and work again, and I know how to do it because I have done it before.
Governor, just very gently, we're under lightning round rules, and this is very slowly.
Okay, I'm going as fast as I can.
All right.
Go ahead.
On defense spending.
You be thunder, I'll be lightning.
Okay.
Yeah.
On defense spending, you seem to be walking a fine line between, on the one hand, talking about massive ways. You say there are 900,000 people helping run the Pentagon who have no direct line authority, but on the other hand, saying you'd like to see an end to the spending caps on Pentagon spending. Those two seem in contradiction, sir.
No, I think we absolutely have to spend more on defense. It's one of the central purposes of the federal government. But, Chris, having served on defense for 18 years and being able to witness the waste, the duplication, the red tape, the slowdown, we don't want to spend money there that goes into bureaucracy and delay that could go into building a stronger defense. There's no inconsistency there. Reform the Pentagon, strengthen the military. That's why I call myself a cheap hawk.
Finally, we got another Republican debate coming up. What's your strategy?
Be myself. Have a good time, enjoy it, and appreciate every moment in this campaign because it's really a special part of life.
Governor, thank you. Always good to talk with you.
That was lightning. That was lightning, Chris.
That one was lightning. Always good to talk with you, sir.
You are a terrific questioner because the answers can only be as good as the people that ask the questions. You're a pro. Thank you for having me on.